Welcome to day 4 of History of Nature. Today we're going to look at engineered and designed landscapes. That is to say, we're going to look at what humans do to the environment and seeing how humans try to control the environment in which they live. We'll begin by looking at the use of fire, then water. We're going to leave air to one side, but we'll be looking at how human activities, both indigenous and post-Enlightenment, that is post-18th century Europe, have affected the landscapes that we see around us. Okie dokes. So, consider what humans need from an environment. We need food and resources, we need space to live, and we need water. And so we modify our environment. We're not the only species to do that. I will talk about this a little bit more, but in particular, as populations settled down and grew, we needed water close at hand. We needed space to till for our crops and to graze our animals. And when we get to small towns, we have food produced outside the walls. House gardens may supplement food supply with things like herbs and spices, but the water supply has to be close at hand. And of course, once you get to bigger towns, the fields become increasingly far away, so they require cartage, and the water supplies that are naturally around get outstripped by the population, and so we need to find ways to get water to these cities. Now, we've done the history of small settlements and big settlements and the increase of complex societies. But two things that we also require once we get to the large town system is building materials. So all of this, and particularly sewage, leads to waste, runoff, and pollution of the immediate area. All right. So in that context, let's go back and have a look how we affect the environment, and particularly the local ecosystems, by our activities. It's been argued for a very long time, even as far back as the classical Greeks, that fire is what separates humans from the environmental impacts of other organisms. Both Friedrich Engels, Marx's supporter and co-author, and Darwin believed that fire was critically important to early humans, and it enabled them to have a more varied diet and to eat food that was already partially digested. In other words, you can eat things which have become digestible in virtue of the fire. Darwin wrote, "Man has discovered the art of making fire by which hard and stringy roots can be rendered digestible and poisonous roots or herbs innocuous." More recently, Harvard's Richard Wrangham, paleoarchaeologist, has argued that fire played a critical role in the evolution of a larger brain, since it provides more available protein, and brains take a lot of energy. Something like 40% of our metabolism goes to feeding our brain. He wrote, "The control of fire would have been a major turning point in human evolution. The impact of cooking food is well documented, but the impact of control over fire would have touched all elements of human society." He makes the point that socializing around a campfire might actually be an essential aspect of what makes us humans. Now, That is to say, campfires make us social. Being social means we need bigger brains in order to process who's in and out and who's saying what, etc. Now, critics are common, and they've argued that the evidence for fire is not early enough because for there to be growth in the human brain via evolution, you would expect that the use of fire would go back at least 2 million years. However, there is evidence from around 300 to 400,000 years ago that Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens used fire. But the the Wonderwerk cave in South Africa is most compelling. We find, that's it down the below, we find fire pits much earlier, something like 500,000 years ago. So fire allowed human beings to alter materials as well as cook them. Fire hardening wooden spears made them more effective. Heat treating various types of rocks makes them flake better and give you harder and sharper points, and so forth. Now, fire has been used in farming for a very long time. It's practiced in the Americas, in Africa, in Southeast Asia and Australia. Papua New Guinea has a lot of fire stick farming, and basically it's called fire stick farming because you get a stick branch, catch it on fire, and then go around lighting grasslands and undergrowth to burn the vegetation in ways that don't damage the ecosystem and in fact improve it. Now, it's called cool burning, and in Australia it's called cultural burning. It shouldn't be confused with slash and burn agriculture, where regions in forests are cut down and then the vegetation that's been slashed is burned in order to put carbon and nitrogen into the soils. That's much more destructive, although at small scale it's quite sustainable. So in Australia, for thousands of years, Aboriginals have been using fire to hunt animals, maintain ecosystems and manage the land. They have a practice they call cool burning, often referred to as cultural burning, and small blazes are set alight to clear the underbrush. The process generates patchy landscapes and habitats preferred by small animals and prevents lightning and wildfires from causing large-scale massive burns. Of course, with the centuries of Euro-Australian suppression of Aboriginal practices, cool burning has diminished. Early settlers viewed fire as a threat rather than a creative management process, and were unable to perceive of cool burning as a landscape management practice. This has since exacerbated the degradation of ecosystems in Australia and put much of our land at the risk of wildfire, or as we call it, bushfire. The severe consequences of this shift in lands management became apparent during the Black Summer, the 2019-20 bushfire season, which consumed more than 18.6 million hectares of land and killed around 1.25 billion wild animals. There's since been a surge of interest from farmers, landowners and communities wanting to learn about these traditional burning practices and how they could be implemented nationwide. It has a symbolic meaning for the Indigenous people. Fire is perceived by Westerners as a destructive force and is considered inimical to civilization, but it holds great spiritual meaning in Aboriginal culture, with stories, memories and dance being passed down around the fire. Fire also connects Indigenous people to the land, with children's Hon4 being taught about the healing powers of fire for the land and its symbolic significance in Aboriginal culture. The central idea of cool burns is fire management using a cool fire. Night times and early mornings are ideal, as nightly dew helps cool down the fire and the winds are often gentle. The practice involves lighting low fires in small areas on foot with matches or traditionally with fire sticks. These fires are closely monitored, ensuring that only the underbrush is burnt, not the trees, the bark and so forth. Cool burns not only clear areas of land, they also ensure that seeds and nutrients in the soil are not baked and destroyed. So, in fact, these fires assist in changing vegetation structures by reducing the density of risk factor plants, such as bracken fern or casuarina, which lead to very hot burning fuel loads. It's not happening here. Here we go. Okay, so a book by Bill Gamage discusses how Aborigines made Australia. The cover art there is of Aborigines doing cool burns in southwestern Victoria, and the painting on the right shows the sort of landscape that develops. Now, grass and woodlands of Australia are fairly open. One European commented how you could drive a carriage as easily across the landscape as in Gentleman's Park in London, but this is the end result of Aboriginal management rather than something that would have happened without them. There's been arguments about this for a long time, but there's a fair bit of racism involved in the claim that Aborigines have not modified their environment. Now, this is a case of what we call in ecology and evolution the niche construction of the environment, or NCT, because niche construction theory. And I'll just briefly read out to you a passage from an introduction. I can make the link available to you if you want it. Niche construction is the process by which organisms modify their own environments and those of other living beings through their activities and decisions, which may lead to changes in the metabolic, physiological and behavioural activities of all organisms involved in this process. Now, that in itself isn't particularly earth-shattering, but then niche construction theory goes on to say, these environmental modifications have the potential to modify or generate selective pressures that feed back to the organisms that perform such environmental modifications and to other organisms that are influenced by these environmental changes. Okay, so that means basically that if you modify your environment, you change the selection on you as a species or a population in that environment. Thus, NCT seeks to explain the adaptive complementarity between organisms and the environment in terms of dynamic and reciprocal interactions. And another inheritance process, in addition to genetic inheritance, that exerts evolutionary influence, which is known as ecological inheritance or heritage. This resembles the inheritance of a territorial property, and it occurs when niche-building organisms substantially modify the environment in a way that they leave behind not only a highly altered environment, but also a legacy of altered selection pressures. Now, to make this a little bit more concrete, I'm not going into it in great detail now, there is a third species of elephant, the forest elephant in Africa, which is much smaller than the plains elephants in Africa. And it's smaller because it's adapted to moving through its environment. But a naive forest in and of itself isn't something that these elephants are able to easily live in. And what's happened over generations is that they've created pathways by knocking over trees and so forth so that they can get to important resources like salt licks and food sources seasonally. This has set up a selection pressure for those elephants that are small enough to go through these tracks every year without being constantly held up by undergrowth and branches and so forth. In other words, they've changed the way it happens. Now think about something like, I don't know, a pig, for example, which lives in the forest. It too now can move more quickly around the forest, find more resources, and so they've changed the selection pressure for those pigs. Okay? When you think about this, you might think that, okay, we can recast what Australian Aborigines have done to their environment as niche construction. Australia was substantially wetter when the Aborigines first started coming to Australia, and it was more heavily wooded. But now, of course, it's mostly dry forest and open grasslands. So they have constructed their environment. Whether or not it's caused biological changes through selection, I cannot say, but they've started the process of niche construction at the very least. Is that what we would want to say about engineered landscapes, about what Westerners do? So think about water. You can't survive without water for more than a couple of days, and considerably less if you're in a hot climate with no shelter. Humans have shown a remarkable ability to shape landscape to change the way water flows, either to get drinking water, to provide for gardens and fields with water, but also for transportation, such as canals. Probably the most spectacular and well-known examples from the ancient world are the Roman aqueducts. Here's an example that's still used as an aqueduct in Roman Gaul, modern-day southern France. Its lower tier was expanded in the 1740s to carry a wide road across the river. They knew how to build things, those Romans. Now, okay, so this is a classic Western modification of your environment. It changes where water sources are available. Does that mean that there is some sort of clear distinction between indigenous attempts and complex society attempts to modify the environment? If you think that, consider this. This is a volcanic landscape in southwestern Victoria, formed around 30,000 years ago by the eruption of Mount Eccles. Starting at least 6,000 years ago, the local indigenous peoples created a complex system of rock-walled eel traps and pools to create what's essentially an aquacultural landscape or a farm. They are farming eels by trapping them. It's quite a complex process, and an early European, G.A. Robinson, wrote that this was an immense piece of ground trenched and banked, resembling the work of civilized man, but which on inspection I found to be the work of the Aboriginal natives, purposefully constructed for catching eels. Notice the distinction between the Aboriginals and the civilized man. He was a person of his time. And here's the sort of things that they do. In the 1970s, Dr. Peter Coates of the Victorian Archaeological Survey conducted surveys at Lake Condah, and Coates and his team found what local Gunditj Mara people had long known about: extensive Aboriginal fish trapping systems comprising hundreds of metres of excavated canals and dozens of basalt rock dam walls constructed over innumerable generations before European contact. Coates estimated that the volume of basalt blocks moved measured in the many hundreds of tonnes. And according to the Australian National Maritime Museum, the traps are a series of canals and graded ponds running for some 35 kilometres around the lake. Gunditj Mara people manipulated water levels to encourage eels to swim into the holding ponds and placed funnel-shaped baskets, you can see one on the right there, at the spillway between ponds to ensure that smaller eels could slip through, in other words, to stock the next generation, and larger eels could be harvested. Eels were transferred from one pond to another like a fish hatchery today, and they would be grown until of an edible size. They may also have been stocked from outside the area as well. I mean, we're really looking at something, some sort of aquacultural industry here. When the eels were harvested, they could be eaten there and then or smoked in hollows of the manna gum for later preservation and trade with other communities. The traps and other abundant wildlife in the area provided by the lake allowed the Gunditjmara people to remain in one central place rather than following the food resources over the seasons. In other words, they became sedentary. Accordingly, they built stone houses around the lake. Archaeologists have suggested there were even villages of stone buildings among the potentially hundreds of stone structures in the area. Okay. And while the network of channels and pools at Lake Condah appear to be unique in Australia in terms of their complexity and the fact they supported a permanent population, the construction of fish traps by nomadic indigenous tribes was common as well. In the Murray-Darling Basin, there is ethnographic and archaeological evidence of networks of fish traps maintained by the local tribes. Furthermore, there's an oral tradition that these traps were not just used to hunt and spear trap fish, but were used to capture fish and grow them for use at large intertribal gatherings, corroborees, which were held along the banks of the river. These were usually every 6 or 7 years. Certainly similar systems have been observed by traditional peoples elsewhere in the world, so this would hardly be surprising. So we're looking here at an engineered landscape by indigenous peoples. So it's not just the Western civilized people. Alrighty, this is a good one. I love this. There's a tiny village that's basically walk in, walk out called Teguida Tesumt. And they oversee a quite historic and unusual salt producing industry. The principal source of salt here isn't water, for this is the Sahara, and there's no sea around for thousands of kilometres. So precious salt is extracted from clay. The entire village is pockmarked with hundreds of salt ponds filled with a pastel-coloured brine water, which is attended to by men, women and children all hard at work. There are small hills all around which are 30 feet high or so, and they were created by the deposition of clay from many years of salt extraction in the area. The region has about 20 springs whose water itself is quite briny, but it's the clay from where the salt is extracted. All right, algae grows in some of the ponds and also colours the water. Now, I won't read the entire piece here. This is obviously from an article by my predecessor in this lecture. But it does show you that there is landscape engineering going on here. They are constructing a niche which makes it possible to live in a very hot, waterless environment by providing salt. And salt is absolutely essential to humans' well-being. Okay. So, is there much of a difference between what we've been discussing and the Roman water supply? They actually used siphons and pumps and tunnels and distribution centres to get water from where they found it, usually up in the hills from springs, which were most often rather pure water. They had very few in the way of environmental pollution, such as feces and leaf litter and all that sort of stuff. So the water was, very pure, and it was one of the things that even in antiquity that Rome was regarded as famous for. What have the Romans ever done for us? Well, there's the aqueduct, etc., etc. Okay, now let's move on to the notion of canals. Canals are basically an extension of the idea of tidal rivers, which can be used to transport resources, people, and food over large distances with a minimal amount of effort. One of the largest canal systems in the world is the Grand Canal in the northeastern and central eastern plains of China, running from Beijing in the north to Zhejiang province in the south. It was constructed in sections from the 5th century before the Common Era onwards, and conceived as a unified means of communication for the empire for the first time in the 7th century during the Sui dynasty. Now, this led to a series of gigantic construction sites, creating the world's largest and most extensive civil engineering project prior to the Industrial Revolution. By the 13th century, there were more than 2,000 kilometres of artificial waterways linking 5 of China's main river basins, still used today as a means of communication. It's a wonderful thing. We've got similar work done with the Dutch, who famously exist in land that is below sea level and is held back by embankments known as dikes. And this creates what are called polders, low-lying tracts of land that form an artificial hydrological entity. That is to say, they are similar to canals, but the land itself is often used for farming. Now, often these areas are marshy, right? So they function as wetlands, but they also function as ways to control floodplains from upriver. There are polders in 21 countries that we know of, including Bangladesh, Belgium, Canada, China, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Guyana, India, Ireland, Italy, Lithuania, the Netherlands, of course, Poland, Singapore, Slovenia, South Korea, Spain, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So it's an interesting way of dealing with water supplies. Obviously, once you've walled these off from the sea, the water is refreshed from rainfall and rivers, and it over time becomes fresh water. Okay, so that's the sort of stuff that we've done, engineered in our environments in order to ensure control of our water systems. We haven't always done it well. So I'd like to talk about Bali. I'm assuming some of you have been to Bali. I went a couple of times, and it's a beautiful place, and it has these carefully crafted rice terraces down the volcanic slopes along the ridgelines. Bali lies just below, south of the equator, and has a tropical climate. It also has fertile volcanic soils, and much of the island has an abundance of water. There's little level land to farm, though. And to overcome this, the Balinese have built thousands and thousands of rice terraces, and along the islands, many ridges. Some of the rice terraces have been farmed for around 1,000 years. And while there's plenty of water running in the deep valleys, getting water to the top of the rice terraces requires a complex system of water management and irrigation. This is mostly managed by a religious set of practices, which we'll talk about. So Stephen Lansing, an anthropologist in the 1980s, published a series of articles beginning with Balinese water temples and the management of irrigation in the American Anthropologist, in which he wrote, "The precise alternation of wet and dry phases achieved through controlled irrigation governs the basic biochemical processes of the terrace ecosystem. Water alters the soil pH. It induces a cycle of aerobic and anaerobic conditions in the soil, which determines the activity of microorganisms, provides a range of mineral nutrients, fosters the growth of nitrogen-fixing algae, excludes weeds, stabilizes soil temperature, and over the long term governs the formation of the plough pan and the maintenance of soil fertility." That's a heck of a thing for an indigenous pre-scientific population to have done. And of course, they didn't do it knowing this. They experimented over time and realized that they got the best results in growing their crop, mostly rice, if they followed a certain cycle. Now, if you are pre-literate or illiterate and you've got a complex process that you need to you need to control, how do you do this? And the obvious way is to do it using religious rituals and calendars. And to that end, they established what are called subaks, which are regions in which there's forests that protect the water supply, terraced paddy landscape, rice field, connected by systems of canals, tunnels and weirs, villages and temples of varying size and importance that mark either the source of the water or its passage through a temple on its way downhill to irrigate subak land. Now this means that they established what has been called a delicate balance of water use and agriculture. And they did it without fully understanding the ways in which this occurs. In the 1970s, however, Western scientists, Western agrarians, encouraged Balinese farmers to use the new varieties of rice that have been developed in the Philippines as part of the Green Revolution. For those who don't know, in the 70s and 80s, to stave off large-scale famines and population crashes, the Green Revolution engineered through selective breeding various kinds of rice and other grain crops that could produce much more usable food for the same amount of water and land, and thereby staved off the expected population crash. Now these new breeds could produce more rice, but only with heavy inputs of fertilizers to make the soil more productive and pesticides to prevent parasites and other pests, which they weren't well suited to naturally staving off the way that the traditional rices did. So the government encouraged, Indonesian government encouraged the farmers to plant as much and as often as possible. This meant that the compromise between water distribution and fallow periods, that is, periods in which the terraces were left to microbial and algal and fungal activity to re-nitrogenize the soil, broke down. And as a result, the harvest suffered massive disease and pest problems. In the 1990s, after Lansing's work, and backed up by computer simulations, work was showed that the traditional system produced the optimal balance between pest control and water distribution, and then farmers were allowed to go back to the old system. In other words, there was an implicit knowledge in their system. It wasn't what any one of them, even the priests, thought. The knowledge was actually embedded in the practices. Let's return to the Western world. There's no shortage of engineered landscapes to choose from in the Western world, but I want to focus on one we may not think of as engineered landscapes: parks and gardens. Excuse me. An early example of a public park, though it's privately funded, is Prince's Park, which you can see in the slide, which opened in Liverpool in 1842 and was designed by Joseph Paxton, whose work is widely regarded as having influenced the designers of New York Central Park. The creation of parks such as Central Park was part of a widespread belief that nature could help provide a cure for the unhealthy environment of cities, very much influenced by romantic conceptions of nature, as well as by the aesthetics of the English landscape gardens of the 18th and early 19th century, which we now will turn to. So, let's talk about gardens. Gardens have existed in one form or another in many different historical periods and cultures. But I want to zero in here on a period of time in which gardens and the Western understanding of nature underwent some profound changes. It's a period known in the history of ideas as the Enlightenment. It was incredibly influential in forming modern commercial, philosophical, psychological and social attitudes towards the world around us. To understand the garden in the Enlightenment and how it was a manifestation of those ideas about nature and the world around us, we need to take a brief detour and talk about what the Enlightenment was. Now, I don't want to get into it in a big way, okay, so don't let this severe-looking philosopher here, Immanuel Kant, put you off. Can you see all of that? I'm not sure if you can. I'll read it to you. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. This immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in a lack of understanding, but in a lack of resolve and courage to use it without guidance from another. Sapere aude, have the courage to use your own understanding. That is the motto of the Enlightenment. Now, it's a view that we've all encountered, I believe. Here is a very famous Enlightenment painting of people, an astronomer showing people how the geometry of the heavens works. But the most interesting expression of the Enlightenment, the central Enlightenment ideal, is the geometric spirit. The Enlightenment was basically founded on a search for certainty as opposed to faith. And it was based on the idea that a rational order needs to rest on knowledge, which is absolutely certain and not open to doubt. And most widely, a view held since Plato, in fact, probably held since Pythagoras before Plato, is that mathematics gives a form of certainty unmatched by other sciences. Now, the application of mathematics to all fields of knowledge could therefore solve problems that were intractable otherwise, that couldn't be dealt with otherwise. And if not the mathematics, qua mathematics, the way Newton would have done it, then the application of the style of thinking that mathematicians used, and the most popular, was geometry, which led to the geometric spirit. And the most famous example of this geometrical garden, or French garden as they came to be known, is the Palace of Versailles and its grounds. I just realized I've had my headphones on when I didn't need them, so I've removed them. Okay, this image shows enormous pump works of the Machine de Marly in the Louveciennes aqueduct. I apologize for my appalling French pronunciation. I never learned French. Built to channel water from the works to the gardens of Versailles. Gardening is very water intensive, and in addition to that, Louis XIV had a large number of fountains and needed a lot of water for them. It was regarded as something of a technological marvel at the time. It was water driven, did not send very much water to Versailles, however. Was enormously costly to repair, suffered from frequent breakdowns and needed 60 staff permanently to maintain it. Functioned, though, for 133 years. Now, it spent a lot of its time this is an elevation of, you can see the piles that were driven into the ground and so forth. It spent a lot of its time actually giving water to the Chateau de Marly, which was another one of the king's chateaus. So water is a very important source of from the environment, something that we spend a lot of time dealing with. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to start talking about the non-geometric style. So we've been looking at gardens which were based on geometries, which had vista. The word vista means an outlook which is framed by trees. Okay, and if you have a look at the view of Versailles here, you will see that standing on the balcony of the palace, you are looking out at a vista, a literal vista. You can see at least one of the fountains there. Now, this is a very geometric view. Everything is symmetrical and balanced, and the grasses are symmetrical and balanced. It's a very artificial view, which is supposed to represent the geometric spirit, that which motivates the Enlightened age. But there's another tradition which has come to be known as the English landscape garden. And it was a reaction to the French style of the 17th century, and it emerged in the early 18th century. So typical features of the English landscape garden are rolling hills and lawns, groves of trees, architectural elements inspired by classical temples, ruins of Gothic churches and other romantic elements. It was initiated by landscape designers William Kent and Charles Bridgman, but the most influential figure in the later development of the English landscape garden was a fellow known as Lancelot Brown, or as his contemporaries called him, Capability Brown. So he lived through the 18th century. The English garden was an idealized vision of nature, and the style was inspired in part by the paintings of Claude Poussin and Nicolas Poussin, representing idyllic Arcadian visions of nature. We talked about Arcadian visions. This is when Arcadian visions became absolutely the big feature of nature in the 18th century Anglo-Australian, Anglo-American, English Empire, British Empire. Okay, so this slide shows a painting by Claude Lorraine entitled Apollo and the Muses on Mount Helicon, and if you have a look at that temple, you'll see that it's very much like this one here. Okay. Another important influence were the gardens of China and Japan, which had been described recently by travellers returning from Asia, mostly Dutch Jesuits or Dutch traders. Now, what struck European travellers in particular was the emphasis on an irregular and asymmetrical geometry in these gardens, and the way they seemed, in many cases, to imitate nature. And this was called Sharawagi, which is a word that was used by William Temple in the late 17th century in an essay called Upon the Gardens of Epicurus. Temple said that he got the word from a Dutch traveller who'd spent some time in China, but there's no Chinese word apparently that matches the term, and it's most likely Japanese, or at least based on Japanese. By the end of the 18th century, the English landscape garden had spread back initially to France and then to the rest of Europe. So the English reaction to the French geometrical spirit had supplanted the French geometrical spirit in France. A very famous example is the park of Armenonville, which, oops, I've gone past, Armenonville, which was also known as the Park of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, after the philosopher who spent time here and who is buried on an island in the park. So this is mid-18th century. But there was another kind of garden, and this one was more politically and economically based. It's what we now call botanical, or in Melbourne, botanic gardens, and it's closely linked to the history of botany itself. Early botanical gardens of the 16th and 17th century were medicinal gardens, often associated with universities. They were sometimes known as physis gardens and were dedicated to the academic study of medicinal plants. The first of these gardens was created in 1543 by Luca Ginea at the University of Pisa, but by the end of the 16th century they'd spread to other European universities, with the University of Oxford Botanical Garden being the first to be established in the UK. Later, they came to house the many strange, exotic, and in many cases economically valuable plants brought back from faraway lands, usually those lands that were part of the empire concern. In the 18th century, they acquired an educational and research-oriented purpose, with botanists using specimens there to classify and study new species of plants. And I'll briefly look at two specific botanical gardens, the Jardin des Plantes in Paris and the Royal Gardens at Kew in the United Kingdom. So, the Jardin des Plantes was founded in 1626, and but wasn't planted out until 1635 as a medicinal herb garden by the Louis XIII, king's physician. It was originally known as the Jardin du Roi, Garden of the King. In 1640, it opened to the public. After a period of decline, it was separated from the court, and Jean-Baptiste Colbert took administrative control of the gardens. The Natural History Museum played a very important role in the development of natural history and biology, with the work of Buffon, we've met him before, who was appointed the garden's director in 1739 and helped transform it into a museum and major research institution. Now, on the right are the hothouses that Buffon and his workers used to grow tropical plants in a temperate environment. And when I visited in, 20 years ago now, those beautiful purple glass windows, they'd gone purple over time due to exposure to the sun, were being replaced with clear glass. And I, aesthetically, I regret that, but I can understand they needed to. On the left is the natural, I'd say in English, the Natural History of National Museum of Natural History, which is a part of the Jardin, but is a separate organisation, and it's a full museum for natural history. Great fun, and I had some cognac in the upper levels of the museum some time ago when it was particularly hot, and the only air conditioning we could find anywhere in Paris was that. It was the middle of summer. All right, the British, of course, had their own version, the Royal Gardens of Kew, and they were founded in 1759. The famous Palm House, which we're looking at there, designed by Decimus Burton, they had such wonderful names in the 18th century, was built much later in the 1840s. Kew Gardens is arguably the best known botanical garden in the world. There were other gardens, such as the Real Jardin Botanico in Madrid, and Pamplemousse Botanic Gardens set up by the French in Mauritius, another one in Tenerife, and of course the British built botanic gardens everywhere they went and brought specimens back and set up botanic gardens in the UK. For example, the current Exeter University is built on the grounds of a private botanic garden. These tropical gardens were created almost entirely to receive and cultivate commercial crops such as cloves, tea, coffee, breadfruit, cinchona, palm oil, as well as chocolate. During these times, para rubber was introduced to Singapore, teak and tea to India, and breadfruit, pepper and starfruit to the Caribbean. So it wasn't just at the centres of empire, it was in the various edges of empire that this was set up. Finally, I would have to note a science fiction connection here because I'm such a nerd. In the last 30 years, well, more than that really, I would say the last 50 years, botanic gardens have seen a revival due to the emergence of the conservation movement. They're now seen as very important because of their existing corrections and the scientific knowledge that they possess in the propagation of plant species. For example, the Melbourne Botanic Gardens are regarded as a leading research institution around the world, and some 10 years ago the Institute of Botany, I think, or Association of Botany, had its annual conference there to celebrate the centenary of that garden. Anyway, botanic gardens have popped up in science fiction, and this is a science fiction film from 1972, and it's very, to our eyes, straightforward, simple special effects and all that, but it was basically an environmentalist movie, the idea being that after an ecological calamity on Earth, the last of Earth's forests and biomes are preserved on spaceships orbiting Saturn. Now, I never fully understood why they would orbit Saturn. The light there is a lot lower, but anyway, it was the idea that giant greenhouses with artificial ecosystems could support a crewed spaceship on a deep space voyage, although there was only one person on this. All right, we're going to have a break now, and then we'll get to the second half of the lecture, which is on religion and nature. All right, so through this subject so far, we've seen Ethiopian Christians, Balinese Hindus, Aboriginal peoples, all involved in what you might think of as conservation or preservation of various biomes. We know that religion is not merely the sum of what Christians in the West do. If we'd more time, I'd look at Confucian and Taoist views of nature, Shinto nature spirits or kami, Islamic views and so on. I could do a subject just on that topic, but arguably, and at least this is what we will now discuss, Western religion, i.e. Christianity and its offshoots, has had the greatest impact on how we treat the world. Now, I think I've said before that Voltaire quipped that the Holy Roman Empire was neither Holy Roman nor an empire. But when Rome took on Christianity, nature took on a new meaning. Nature was what God had created, and it was therefore subject only to corruption, not to improvement. History, which had been largely thought of as cyclical or indeed infinite, became linear and finite under the Christian view. and it took on a moral dimension. It was either sinful or something God made for us to use. Now, there was a tradition of using nature as a moral lesson, which was basically in the tradition of Aesop's fables, but you'd get multiple sermons where, different creatures would stand in for Christ, or bravery or nobility or intelligence and so forth. So there was that view that nature was somehow telling us, or at least was the occasion for ways for people to tell us about the nature of God and ourselves. In the 1960s, this gentleman, Lynn White Jr., his surname, by the way, for those who aren't familiar with Western conventions, is White. You don't have to call him White Jr. He published a short paper in Science, but he was a historian. And he was a historian of technology. So it was kind of odd that he would publish a paper called The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis. Not sure why he used the word ecologic when ecological was common, but there you go. So I'll read this. In the early church, and always in the Greek East, nature was conceived primarily as a symbolic system through which God speaks to men. The ant is a sermon to sluggards, that's from Proverbs. Rising flames are the symbol of the soul's aspiration. This view of nature was essentially artistic rather than scientific. However, in the Latin West by the early 13th century, natural theology was following a very different bent. It was ceasing to be the decoding of the physical symbols of God's communication with man, and was now becoming the effort to understand God's mind by discovering how his creation operates. And this came to be known as the two books thesis. There was the Book of Revelation and the Book of Nature, and they both had the same author. There's a certain degree of correctness, I think, about this, but it is, I think, a very simplified view of what was going on. Now, he continues, Christianity inherited from Judaism not only a concept of time as non-repetitive and linear, but also a striking story of creation. God planned all of this explicitly for man's benefit and rule. No item in the physical creation had any purpose save to serve man's purposes, and although man's body is made of clay, he is not simply part of nature, he is made in God's image. Christianity, in absolute contrast to ancient paganism and Asian religions, except perhaps Zoroastrianism, not only established a dualism of man and nature, but also insisted it is God's will that man exploit nature for his proper ends. By destroying pagan animism, this is the idea that the natural world is filled with spirits, Christianity made it possible to exploit nature in a mood of indifference to the feelings of natural objects. Our science and technology have grown out of Christian attitudes towards man's relation to nature, which are universally held not only by Christians and neo-Christians, but those who fondly regard themselves as post-Christians. Despite Copernicus, all the cosmos rotates around our little globe. Despite Darwin, we are not in our hearts part of the natural process. We are superior to nature, contemptuous of it, willing to use it for our slightest whim. Now, this is where I start to part, away from the White thesis. I'm not sure that he's correct about paganism. We talked about that when we talked about sacred groves. I'm not sure that he's even correct about Christian attitudes to nature. I'm also not sure if it came from Christianity and Judaism via Christianity. So the non-Christian Stoics, who are quite early, they begin not long after Aristotle. They also treated nature that way, and it was very popular in the Roman era, and it's possible, arguable, that the Christian view has inherited the Stoic view of nature. right? Um, It's hard also to generalize over medieval Western Christianity, as there were many different views and traditions. For example, Francis of Assisi. So it's arguable at best that the Christian worldview is responsible for exploitative technology and science. It also ignores the rise of capitalism in the 14th century, which was directly contrary to the Church's teachings on borrowing or lending at interest, which it called usury. One of the things that I believe people have overemphasized over the years is that there is some sort of difference between our constructed environment and the environment to which we were adapted in the Pleistocene era. I think this is absolute and arrant nonsense. We always adapt to our social environment before we adapt to our biological environment, at least once our food and shelter has been taken care of. And I think it's better to look at urban environments and agrarian environments and what have you as one of the normal ecotypes that humans spend their time in. Yes, we construct it, but that was the point of the niche construction argument. We have adapted to our constructed environments with the spread of genes for lactose tolerance, with the spread of genes that inhibit certain diseases, and presumably also, although this is sometimes debated, skin colour appears to be an adaptation to too much vitamin D otherwise in tropical environments. So, as we move around the planet and as we get into different environments, we adapt to it. The one that I think is most stark here is the Tibetan and Andean populations' adaptation to extremely high altitudes and thus less oxygen in their environment. So, the other thing is that people seem to think that nature has what Aristotle called the souls, the animi, immanent powers inside that make them do what they do, and that they have this in virtue of some essence. There is an essence to human beings which we call human nature. There is an essence to dogs and cats which is their nature, and so forth. I think we can drop that idea at this point, but that's something to discuss in the tutes if you need to. So we talked about the great chain of being before. Lovejoy distinguished between vertical conceptions of nature, basically an array of increasing complexity and or perfection, and horizontal conceptions of nature, which is nature as a web or an ecological web that has been presented to us by where we are and by the world in general. Now, the great chain of being that Lovejoy talks about with the vertical conceptions, it started out, let's have a look at the image. It started out as, that diagram that I showed you in the last lecture, as an illustration of Aristotle's three-soul theory. By the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, you're starting to look at a much more complex scale, which goes from minerals to angels and God is above all. Not surprising that you would get that sort of a hierarchy in a religious context. But even in natural history, we get a scale of being, or a chain of being, or a ladder of being, which this one is from 1745. It was the work of an entomologist, Charles Bonnet, and Bonnet argued that there was a scale of being, a linear scale of being, from the very bottom, which is basically inanimate material, all the way up to humans. And you'll notice that he's got this sort of fishes are above insects and serpents and all this sort of stuff. I mean, it's a very, very strange scale. But just so you don't think that we are better than they were because we've moved past chains of being, this was published in 1995 by a British evolutionary biologist and Hungarian systems theorist, John Maynard Smith and Eös Zsáthmáry. Unfortunately, John Maynard Smith is gone. He died in 2001, shortly after I met him, but I'm not responsible. And Zsáthmáry is still around, but this is called the major transitions of evolution. And the reason why I think it's a great chain of being is that it is a linear scale from simplicity to complexity, based around information transfers, how much information is moved around by the organism. I think this is just mistaken. I think it's old think, and it sits very badly with modern evolutionary biology. Okay, so I've put some discussion points up. They'll be in the PDFs. These are the sorts of things that we can discuss in the lecture or in the tutes, depending how we go. And I look forward to discussing them with you. Okay, I should assert once more that you don't get marked down if you disagree with me. You may even get marked up if you disagree intelligently. Okay, you won't lose marks. All right, folks, that's it. I'll see you on Monday, and those of you who I will be tutoring, I'll see you after this.